is a sign if you can't see it, if you can't understand its language, if you don't know what it means? Many years ago, when I was a young truck driver, I got pulled over by a police officer for speeding. He told me I was going 50 in a 35-mile-an-hour zone. I said, "Sir, I drive my truck down this road every day on my job, and I've never seen a 35-mile speed limit sign." He said, "There's one right back there." So after he issued me the ticket, I walked back, and I found behind a tree the back of a speed limit sign. When I went around front and moved the branches, it was 35 miles an hour, but I certainly couldn't see it. I came back the next day with a camera. No one had cell phones in those days. I took a picture of the sign hidden by a tree. I took it to court, and I didn't have to pay the ticket. What good is a sign if you can't see it, if it's in another language and you can't understand it? Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. And the disciples asked him for a sign, and he said, "I'll give you a sign. It's called the Abomination of Desolation," Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. But there's been much speculation about what this sign is. It's got a crazy, spooky kind of name. A lot of fanciful speculation about what it means. For instance, in this commentary that I enjoy very much by an author I like very much, it says about this verse that the Antichrist will set up a statue of himself, a talking statue of himself, in the temple and cause people to worship it. And so it's kind of like an audio animatronic Disney attraction, the Hall of Presidents, or in the Haunted Mansion, where moving statues talk. Is that what Jesus was talking about? Is that something the disciples should look forward to, or something that we should look for? I want to tell you tonight what the abomination of desolation that Jesus spoke of doesn't mean and what it does mean. I believe that the Bible tells us very clearly what this sign is and how we can recognize it. And so I promise tonight to reveal to you, not from speculation, but from the Bible, what the abomination of desolation is. Hi, my name is Jeff Hartman, pastor of First Baptist Church of Troy. And we are studying our way through what is called the Olivet Discourse, Jesus' teaching on prophecy in Matthew 23, 24, and 25. This is our fifth study. And remember, the background is Matthew 23, the temple, and the destruction of the temple. Jesus said at the end of Matthew 23, all these things will come upon this generation, that generation, the first generation. Then in Matthew 24, at the end of Matthew 24, he says, "I say to you, this generation," not our generation, not some future generation, but their generation, "will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So we should understand them to be for the first century. At least that's what Jesus seems to be clearly saying. And he does answer these questions the disciples ask. "Tell us, when will these things be?" He said, "They'll be in this generation. What will be the sign of your coming?" Is that different? Is this a question about the second coming? We asked several weeks ago, why would the disciples be asking about the second coming when they didn't expect Jesus to die or to leave? What will be the sign of the end of the age? What did they mean by the end of the age? The end of the world or the coming of his kingdom, the coming of the church? Tonight we come to the study what the abomination of desolation is. But Jesus begins by answering their questions. And his first concern was, we saw a couple weeks ago, the end is not yet. Don't be deceived, don't be fooled, and don't be troubled. He said, I don't want you to worry about those kind of things. Don't be troubled. The end is not yet. All these things are just the beginning of sorrows. So they were just at the beginning of the sorrows. We may be in the middle, but he doesn't want us to worry, and he doesn't want us to be deceived. And I don't want you to be deceived about what the abomination of desolation is. So let's study it tonight, beginning in Matthew 24, verse 15. Jesus said, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. It's not supposed to be vague and hard to grasp. It's supposed to be clear and easy. Whoever reads, let him understand. Then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. When you see this, then do that. So I want you to see that Jesus here is finally answering the question, what will be the signs of these things taking place? Jesus gives the apostles their answer. They ask, when will these things be? The destruction of the temple, your coming, the end of this age, and the beginning of the new age. He says it to them, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel. Remember, he said, all these things will come upon this generation. Later on in Matthew chapter 24, he's answering these things, and he tells them these things will take place in this generation. So they ask, when will these things be? And Jesus is now answering, it will be in that generation because you will see the abomination of desolation. We have to assume right up front that this is something that will take place in the first century, that these apostles will see in their flesh with their own eyes. Jesus tells them, it is to you. That's why I believe all this speculation about robots in the end of time are not answering the question. That's not what Jesus was talking about. When we talk about the abomination of desolation, it's something that is personal. It's something that they will see and they should be able to recognize. I also want you to see that it is something that will be visible. If the sign is behind a tree and you can't read it, it doesn't help, right? It will be something that they can see. It will be personal and it will be visible. So now let's look at the actual word, the words, the abomination of desolation. Sounds spooky. It literally means an appalling horror. What does it mean? Well, I'd like to look at the background, the context, what Jesus is pointing to. If you go back to Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 30, God says in Jeremiah, for the children of Judah have done evil in my sight, says the Lord. They have set their abominations, that word, in the house which is called by my name to pollute it. The temple, a previous temple to this one, Herod's temple. But my people, the Jewish people, have put their abominations in my house. If we look also later in Jeremiah chapter 32, they, my people, set their abominations in the house which is called by my name, the temple, to defile it. So who is going to cause the abomination? Some future Antichrist? Some Roman conqueror? Well, the precedent in the Old Testament was that God's people had put their abominations in the temple. Later on in Ezekiel chapter 5, God again says, surely because you have defiled my sanctuary, the temple, with your detestable things, and with your, there's the word, abominations, therefore I will also diminish you. My eye will not spare, nor will I have any pity. God promises his judgment on his people for their sins. This is the context. The word abomination literally means nauseating from revulsion. It's like when you see something very gross and you get sick to your stomach. If you see a graphic image on television or even in person, if you saw a boxer bite off the ear of another boxer, if you saw a football player's leg get bent in a place that it shouldn't bent, you immediately cringe. It's nauseating. That is an abomination of desolation. And this is what God says about the idolatrous filth. That's the word here. Disgusting filth, like raw sewage. That's what their idolatry was, especially in the very temple. And he's talking here about some self-inflicted wounds because it's abominations that they have placed in the temple. It's an abomination of desolation, and that word desolation is in the immediate context, not in Ezekiel, not in Jeremiah in the Old Testament, but in Matthew chapter 23. Jesus has just predicted at the end of Matthew 23, this generation that has turned from God and will soon call for the crucifixion of their Messiah. He says, see, your house is left to you desolate. The house is left desolate not because of the attack of some future Antichrist, but because of the people forsaking God. The house will become desolate, deserted, and that's what the abomination of desolation is. It is something that comes as a result of the sin of God's people. It is literally the abomination that makes desolate. You could translate it that way. The abomination which belongs to desolation? No, that word of could be translated the abomination that makes desolate. And so these things that you've introduced into the temple worship will make the place deserted. And of course, Jesus predicted that it will be destroyed and not one stone will be left upon another. It will be left empty. It will be rendered worthless. It will become useless. Already it is disgusting and nauseating in God's sight, so he's going to have it destroyed. Now notice Jesus says this abomination that causes desolation is personable, visible, and very specific. The abomination of desolation is not just something we need to speculate about. It's something that has been talked about, the abominations that you've brought into my house, but it is talked of specifically by Daniel the prophet. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Now we've looked at Jeremiah and we've looked at Ezekiel, but he's really quoting from Daniel. Daniel speaks very specifically about the abomination of desolation. Look in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. After the 62 weeks, these are weeks of years, 7 years each, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. So, some 400 years later, if you take 7 times 70, that's 490 years. Some 490 years later, the Christ will be cut off, but not for himself. Already predicting Messiah would be crucified, but for the sins of the people. And on the wing of abominations shall one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, the end, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. So in connection with the death of the Messiah, his people calling for his blood to be on their head, on the wings of that, there will come in a destruction to not that temple, but a future temple, abominations which make desolate, as we saw earlier. This will be the end of that age and the coming of the new age, which will leave God's people desolate. He actually doesn't use the word abomination of desolations there, but he does in Daniel chapter 11, verse 30. They shall defile the sanctuary fortress, then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Daniel makes this very specific prophecy, prediction, that they, whoever they are going to come in and tear this place down that has become an affront to God. The sacrifice will be taken away, and we know historically that because of Calvary, the sacrifice has been taken away. They will destroy the city, and they will destroy the sanctuary, which is exactly what happens 490 years later when Rome comes in and destroys Jerusalem, sacks the city, but tears down the temple and does not leave one stone upon another. I want to take a closer look back at this abomination of desolation one more time in Daniel. From the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Some other time when we're studying Daniel, we'll look at what that might mean. But the abomination of desolation is spoken of over and over again by Daniel. What is he talking about? Let's go back to that Daniel's 70 weeks. Daniel was concerned about, is everything at an end now? And he goes back and he reads Jeremiah, and Jeremiah says there will be, he's wondering about the 70 years being over. God says, never mind the 70 years of captivity, I'm going to give you 77s, 70 periods of 7 years each, 490 years. And so here's this spectacular prophecy. After the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. This is a prediction of Rome coming in and destroying the city and the sanctuary that was fulfilled literally in 70 AD. The end of it shall be with a flood. Till the end of the war, desolations are determined. It's not just political circumstance. This is God's judgment on his people for their unbelief. And it is determined by God. In verse 27, we read, then he, and this is not Christ, this would be the most near pronoun, the prince to come, shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he, now the New King James capitalizes that as if it's Jesus, but I believe it's the prince. In the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. So you know what? It could refer to the prince who is to come. He will tear down the temple and the sacrifices end. But it also could secondarily point to Christ, because Christ really ended the need for sacrifice by replacing all those sacrifices when he died, as Hebrews said, once for all. I believe this shouldn't be a capital H. He, the prince, and then he refers to, it would be confusing if he was referring back to Christ. When you say he said, he said, he said, people keep on assuming you're talking about the person you refer to last. He refers to the prince, then he refers to the prince, shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined by God, and is poured out on the desolate. So, who is he who makes desolate? Well, it's God. And it's also Rome, the prince who is to come. And it's also Jesus by his death. But specifically, it was done agency by Rome, by those armies. And so when you see this language, you have to go back and see who he is, who Daniel was talking about, so you know who Jesus was talking about. So it's not only personal, it's not only visible, but it is specific and it's biblical. Because when we see in Daniel chapter 2, remember there is in Daniel chapter 2 4 successive kingdoms. There is Babylon, and then there's Persia, and then there's Greece, and there's Rome. The fourth kingdom points 490 years down the road. That fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all of the others. And in the days of these kings, in the time of Rome, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. This is not a prophecy about a future 1,000-year millennium. This is about an eternal kingdom that will not be set up in the future, but was set up when Christ set up his kingdom at the resurrection of Christ. And so in the days of these kings, Rome, remember, it was in the days of Caesar Augustus that Jesus was born. It was in the days of Caesar that Jesus was crucified and Jesus rose again. In the days of those kingdoms, this is when it's going to take place. So Daniel's talking about the abomination of desolation, which will take place during the first century, the time of Rome, and the time of the death and the resurrection of Christ. It is the fourth beast that he's obsessed with. In Daniel chapter 7, he comes back and he saw another vision. Behold, the fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So what we see is the prince of Rome, the prince who is to come in the time of Daniel, but he's already come by the time of Jesus. And so what we have is not only a personal sign for them. It's not just a stop sign for everybody, but it's a sign given to the disciples, Christ's followers. It's visible, they'll be able to see it. It is specific. You've got to go back to the Old Testament to know what it is, but it's biblical. We don't find out what it is by speculating about it, some talking statue. We find out what it is by reading the Bible. It's very biblical. The abomination of desolation was spoken of by Daniel the prophet. He tells you what it is. So what is it? Well, let's go on a little bit more. This abomination of desolation will be standing in the holy place. Remember that commentator said there would be a talking statue set up in the temple. Well, that temple was destroyed. And there is no temple in Jerusalem now. So many believe that a temple will be constructed in Jerusalem so that this can be fulfilled. Maybe it already has. Who will set up what and where? Well, we could look at 2 Thessalonians 2. The man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Is this the abomination of desolation? That's where much of this speculation comes from. The man of sin, who is he? Well, actually, he doesn't stand in the holy place. This says he sits in the holy place. The holy place had no seats because the priest's jobs were never done. But this man will go in and sit down. Is this a future person, or is this something that's already happened? What is the holy place? Is the holy place the temple? Is it the Holy of Holies? Actually, when we look at the way the Bible refers to the holy city, That's usually called the holy place. For instance, Acts chapter 6, verse 13. They also set up false witnesses who said, "This man, Stephen, does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law." Stephen wasn't talking badly against the temple, probably. When they say this place, this holy place, they're probably talking about the holy city. This is a false accusation against Stephen, the first Christian martyr. The city would be rebuilt, but the temple would not. The temple to be rebuilt at this time, if the Jewish people were to rebuild a temple in Jerusalem now, it would not be a place where a sacrifice would be blasphemous. The temple was a place where it pointed to Jesus, but when Jesus died, remember significantly, the veil was torn and God opened up the door. Will it be rebuilt? I don't know. Maybe it will, but if it does, it will not be a place where sacrifices should take place. Jesus replaced those. Really, it's moot. It's not important because it's already been fulfilled, as we'll see in a moment. In Mark, as Mark gives us the same words as we see in Matthew 24, notice the way he puts it. He puts it a little bit differently. Mark 13:14. When you see the abomination of desolation, it's personal, it's visible, you'll see it, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not. Doesn't say the holy place, but the holy place is where it ought not. These are just two different ways of saying the same thing. But no wonder people come up with fanciful solutions when they try and figure out what it is without looking at what the Bible says. Is it easy to understand? Well, Jesus seems to say it is, because he says, whoever reads, let him understand. It's going to be very personal. You're going to see it. It's visible. It's specific. It's biblical. It's not a puzzle that can't be solved until the 21st century. It's something you'll see. It's something you will understand. Jesus said it. So, is it clear? Can we understand what it is? The red flag is it needs to be clearly understood. If it's not in clear letters, if it's not visible because something is in front of it, it's not a fulfillment to this prophecy that Jesus gives. And so, Jesus tells us what it is. The New Testament tells us what it is, and I'm going to show you exactly what it is. When you leave a sermon of mine, I don't want you to say, where did you get that? I want you to be able to say, oh, how did I miss that? Well, I think that's what's going on here with me. For a long time, I didn't understand it. Jesus said it's clear, and I said, no, where did he get that? But then when I read the Bible through, I said, boy, how did I miss that? Let me show you what the abomination of desolation is according to Jesus. We read Mark's account of the Olivet Discourse. Let's look at Luke's. Keep reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, as Luke in chapter 21 gives us the same words in different words. When he gets to the abomination of desolation, he says, when you see, just like here, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. And then he goes on to say, when you see that, run for the hills, just like in Matthew 24:16. Here, Luke tells us what Jesus meant when he said the abomination of desolation. Matthew and Mark were written to Jewish believers or to Jewish unbelievers, but Jewish people would understand what the abomination of desolation would mean because they knew. Ezekiel and Daniel and Jeremiah. Luke was written largely for Gentiles. Luke was a Gentile doctor, and he wrote largely for Gentiles, didn't believe that they would know the Jewish references, so he translates abomination of desolations for us. It will be Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem to destroy the city. Jerusalem, the holy place, will be surrounded by armies, and when it is, you need to get out. Well, if we're surrounded, how are we supposed to get out? Good question. I will answer that. But I want you to understand, Luke 21 tells us exactly what the abomination of desolation is. It's not a talking statue in the Holy of Holies in some future rebuilt temple. It is the armies of Rome surrounding Jerusalem in the 1st century, not in the 21st century. This is really a fulfillment of a passage all the way back in the Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 14. If you've ever read through Leviticus, sometimes it can be tedious reading, but there's all these strange rules and regulations. For instance, about a desolate house full of abominations. Leviticus 14, verse 44, then let the priest come and look at this dirty house, if it's got mold, mildew, some kind of disease. If the plague has spread in the house, it is an active leprosy in the house, it is unclean. He shall break down the house, its stones, its timber, and all the plaster of the house, and he shall carry them outside the city to an unclean place. You don't want to live in a plagued house. And so the priest would be the inspector. And if the house was growing some kind of mold or mildew, it was not healthy to live, the house would try to be cleaned. If it couldn't be cleaned, then it would be destroyed. This is not only a health regulation for the people of Israel, it's also a picture of God saying, when you filthy up my house with abominations, I will make it desolate by my job of destruction. And I want you to know that all early Christian fathers, all early commentators understood that this was Jerusalem being destroyed by the army Romans. They knew it was personal and visible to the apostles. It was specific and biblical. They thought it was clear. Whoever reads, let him understand. For hundreds of years, Christians understood this to be Jerusalem being destroyed by the Roman armies. For instance, Clement of Alexandria, who lived from 150 AD to 215 AD, wrote, the half of the week Nero held sway, and in the holy city, Jerusalem, placed the abomination. And the half of the week he was taken away, and Otho, the next Roman emperor, and Galba, the next one, a few months later, and Vitellius, and Vespasian rose in the supreme power and destroyed Jerusalem and desolated the holy place. They understood the abomination of desolation to be the destruction of Jerusalem that Jesus predicted in Matthew 23 and the disciples asked about in Matthew chapter 24. What do you do if you know about the desolation of Jerusalem before it happens? Well, you prepare for it, right? What would you do if you knew about 911 before it happened? You'd probably get out of Dodge, out of New York City, right? What would you do if you knew about the crash of 1929? You'd probably get out of the stock market, right? What do you do if you know that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed by Rome in that generation? Well, you'd watch for the sign and then you'd get out of town, right? Maybe you'd get out of town beforehand. Jesus gives them the answer to their question. When will these things be? Then Jesus gives, for the next few verses, some advice. Jesus gives them their answer. Then Jesus gives them some advice. What do you do? Because you know beforehand, I've already told you. Then he says, when you've seen that sign, let those who are in Judea, not everywhere in the world in some worldwide tribulation, but then those in those times, about 70 AD, who are in Judea, flee to the mountains. Good luck for me, I grew up in New Jersey. We didn't have any mountains. We didn't even have any hills. We couldn't flee to the mountains, but we didn't need to. We were in New Jersey, not in Judea. Let whom was in the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who was in the field not go back to get his clothes. Woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Here's Jesus' advice. Here's some common sense advice. When the city's under attack, protect yourself. Don't say God will save us. God did not plan on saving them. The destruction was his judgment on Jerusalem. So Jesus says, first of all, in verse 16, let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Hey, if it starts raining, come in out of the rain. Hey, when war comes, head for the hills. Get in your bomb shelter. He's talking about those in Judea, then, a specific time, those in Judea, a specific place, and he gives them specific advice. Flee to the mountains. Get out of the city. He gives them an advance warning because he wants them to take some good precautions. And it's too late if you wait until the end. What good would the stop sign be after the intersection? Jesus gives the sign before the intersection where the danger is. And so he warns them, here's what you do. Is this good advice for the end of the world and the second coming? Then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains? Is fleeing to the mountains any protection from Jesus Christ's return? Of course not. This is useless for the end of days. And there is no exemption from tribulation, if it's worldwide, by running to the mountains. He goes on to say in verse 17, let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. This is another clear hint that this is not for the future or even the present. This is for the first century, because to say him who is on the housetop would be anachronism now. People don't go onto their housetop. We don't go up and eat dinner on the housetop. We don't go up and sun on the housetop. Actually, this is something that they did in the first century. Jesus in the upper room may have been on a housetop. We're not sure. But we do know that housetops were places where people had access, like in the story in Mark chapter 2. Remember the men who couldn't get their friend to Jesus who was crippled? So they climbed up on the roof and they let him down. Well, how'd they get up there? A ladder to carry a man on a stretcher? Actually, there's probably stairs, because they would build these upper rooms where they could have a cool breeze in the evening, where they could have warmth of the sun in the winter during the day. They would use the housetop as a second floor where they might have a porch, where they might have some kind of dining room like Jesus in the upper room. We see this specifically in Acts chapter 10, when Peter went on their journey, drew near the city. He went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. Remember the very important vision that Peter got about all the animals, clean and unclean, in a sheet. It was on a housetop praying. You see, it is an urgent thing, but if you're on the housetop, you better just get out of town. But when Jesus comes back, are we going to be on a housetop? No, but when Jerusalem is destroyed in the first century, it would be, people would be on the housetop, people wouldn't be in a basement, they didn't have those. Anachronistic means out of time. That's like an actor playing in a movie from ancient times has a wristwatch on. It's out of time, anachronism. It's obsolete. People don't use the housetop. This advice is not good for the 21st century. It was good for the first century, but it does express to them urgency, immediacy. Get out now. Don't wait. Don't say, well, we better start packing. We'll go tomorrow. It is perhaps something about don't pack and, you want to be secret. You just want to get out of town. If you pack your bags, you might cause a panic, and then you might not get out of town. So if you're a believer and you believe my words, you get out of town, but don't start a panic and don't pack your bags. He gets even more specific about that in verse 18. He says, let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. In the field was very appropriate for people in the first century, because most people were farmers. In the field was where most people would be during the day. And so we see that in the way that Jesus told stories. For instance, in Matthew chapter 13, the first parable was, behold, a sower went out to sow. Everyone knew that because 95% of people were sowing seed. They were in the field. The next parable he tells is about a man who sowed good seed in his field. And the next parable was, in verse 31, a man took a mustard seed and sowed it in his field. And the next one, 4 parables in a row. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. Then he told a couple of other parables. One about fishing. Some people were fishermen. Some people did other things. But largely it was an agrarian society where most people had to grow their own food or starve. When Jesus says, if you're in the field, you're at work. Today we might say if you're at the office. Well, not everyone works in an office, but we understand what that means, right? In the field would be like at the office in the first century. But why would he say in the field to people in the 21st century? Actually, it's also a reference to urgency. Don't go back. Don't go back to get your clothes. Why? Well, in Luke chapter 17, remember that Jesus warned, likewise as it was in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built, but on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. When the destruction comes, it's going to be sudden, so you need to get out of town. Remember what Jesus also said, remember Lot's wife? Lot's wife, when they were trying to leave Sodom, what did she do? She turned back. Don't turn back. Get out of the city. So Jesus saying it's urgent and it's immediate. Again, this is another anachronism, an agrarian society, not like our own. Very few people are farmers today, at least in our country. It is urgent and immediate, but this is also moral advice. Don't be attached to this world. When you see this kind of destruction going on, don't worry about getting all your trinkets and all your clothes. You just get out of Dodge, get out of town, come in when it's raining, be careful, take care of yourself. And then he has another word of advice in 19 and 20. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing, both female, in those days. It's going to be a tough time for women. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Well, they can't help when it is. But your flight, if it's in the winter, you might have ice on the wings. If it's on the Sabbath, you may not be able to get in or out. You may not be able to travel that far. Here's 4 pieces of advice. You don't want to be pregnant. You don't want to be nursing. You don't want to be in winter. You don't want to be on Sabbath. We can't help when it is. But here are these 4 things that we're supposed to worry about with our salvation at the second coming. Probably not. These are words of human compassion from Jesus. It's going to be a tough time. It's going to be especially tough on women with little children, women who are expecting, if they've got to run out of town. These have nothing to do with salvation, your eternal salvation. This has to do with your flight getting out of town. So if you're pregnant, it's going to be tough. You're going to have trouble getting out of town, running with that great big suitcase in your belly. It's also going to be tough if you've got little kids, if you're nursing. But in winter, well, you understand sometimes it's tougher. Winter's colder, winter has shorter days, harsher weather, bad roads. Maybe it'd be tough to get out of town. But also if it's the Sabbath. Now, if we talk about the Sabbath, why wouldn't you want to be on the Sabbath? Well, you need to know that these early Jews were only allowed to travel so far on the Sabbath. Remember, in Acts chapter 1, they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey. A good practicing Jew could only go so far on the Sabbath day, otherwise it would be considered work. They had a phrase, a Sabbath day journey, which is how many yards. If it's on a Sabbath day, you'd have to break the law to get out of town. And there were some observant Jews among the believers in the first century. We see when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. They said to him, Acts 21:20, "Brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law." Well, if you're zealous for the law, you're going to have to violate your conscience or risk your life, because you're going to have to go greater than a Sabbath day journey to get out of the danger zone. But I think there's an even more practical reason for this warning. Pray it's not on the Sabbath. Because I believe the gates would be locked on the Sabbath, and the day of the Sabbath, you wouldn't be able to get in or out. In Nehemiah chapter 13, Nehemiah is trying to clean up the town, but he gets very concerned. When he saw the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, he commanded the gates to be shut and charged that they must not be opened until after the Sabbath. Why? People were bringing all their goods in to have a great big flea market and sell their stuff on the Sabbath day. Of course, that's prohibited. You're terrible Jews if you do that. So he said, I posted some of my servants at the gate so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. This was prohibited. So going in and going out, the gates would be locked. They may already be locked. But if they're locked because there is a blockade, because they're surrounded by armies, you wouldn't be able to get out. So what is going on here? Actually, I believe Jesus is giving them a sign that is useful and practical and will save their very lives. So how is it that when you're surrounded and you see the sign, you should get out? Interesting. Historically, this is exactly what happened. Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. That's the exact fulfillment of Jesus' prediction, the Abomination of Desolation. And the city got shut up, locked down, and the people were ready to fight. But then, miraculously, mysteriously, the armies of Rome, with their blasphemous banners that said, Caesar is Lord, that's an abomination to God, they left. Why? Because word came from Rome that Rome was under attack. Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. Jerusalem was locked down. And then the Roman armies left. And the Jewish people wiped their brow and said, that was a close one, but God is watching out for us. But the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem recognized the prophecy of Jesus, and they got out of town. They left, they went to the hills, The Jews stayed in place. The unbelieving Jews stayed in place. The Christian Jews left town, went to the hills. Their lives were spared. When the Roman armies came back just a few months later, Jerusalem was absolutely destroyed. Not one stone left upon another, and 1 million Jews were killed. And so, quite literally, those who took the warning of Jesus, the gates went back open, and these Christians left. Maybe in some kind of compassion, they told their neighbors, you better get out of town. But maybe, like Noah warning those, they didn't take flight. They said, no, God's watching out for us. He would never let us be destroyed. We're the apple of his eye. But the believers in Jesus were saved because they obeyed Jesus and they took this practical advice. This is exactly what happened. Those who took flight were saved. They took flight before, it was like the stop sign came before the intersection. Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. They got out of town when the armies left. The armies came back and destroyed. So it is a practical, physical escape from the city. They had the opportunity for a couple of months, but then the destruction came. I want you to see that this is not unprecedented. Just a few centuries before, 168 BC, a man came into Jerusalem, Antiochus Epiphanes, and everyone in Jerusalem in the first century would remember this. It would be like our Revolutionary or Civil War. This Antiochus Epiphanes hated the Jews and hated God, and so he built a statue of Zeus in the temple, and then he sacrificed a pig. Of course, you know that's terribly unclean to a Jew. A pig on the altar. And then he slew 40,000 of the Jews in Jerusalem. It was a terrible day. Be like our Civil War where we killed each other for almost a decade. And this would be still fresh in their mind. It's going to be worse than that, Jesus says. Sure enough, in 40 AD, right after Jesus' death and resurrection, Caligula, the Roman emperor, planned and planted an image of himself in the temple. It got abandoned, but it was not a very smart political move. It caused all kinds of ruckus, but this was not it. Jerusalem was not surrounded by armies. There was just a blasphemous, idolatrous figure put up in the temple. It was eventually taken down. In 66 AD, Cestius Gallus had the city surrounded, but then he mysteriously retreated. Was it a sign of divine intervention? No. It was a chance for God's people to escape. They did. A year later, in 67 AD, the Zealots, these are Jews who were political rebels against Rome. They used the temple as a hideout. They killed all the priests. They thought they were not faithful to God. They ended up turning the temple into a house of prostitution. They harbored criminals. They installed one of their insane friends. His name was Fanny. And they made him high priest. They put an abomination in the temple. They caused the temple in 68 AD to become a house of prostitution, killed the priests, and installed their own mock priest. Then the Idumeans, a year later in 68 AD, surrounded the city with 20,000. They went straight to the temple, and they slit 8,500 throats of Jews. Is that it? No, that wasn't the Abomination of Desolation. Actually, it took place in 70 AD. Then we can understand that all these things lead up to 70 AD when Titus comes from Rome, surrounds the city with blasphemous Roman banners that say Caesar is Lord, and they come back, they siege the city, burn the temple, and they then tear down the holy city and the holy place. 1 million Jews were killed. How many Christians? Significantly 0. Everyone escaped to Petra, where the Zealots had gone. It was a sign to them, and the first century Jews saw it. They saw it. When you see the Abomination of Desolation, then if you're in Judea, flee to the mountains. They did, and they were saved. If we see the signs of the times today, for us, not Matthew chapter 24, then we will understand and we will obey, especially the one to come to him and be saved. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for these verses, not written to us or about us, but written for us. Lord, help us to learn from the mistakes of Old Testament and New Testament people. Lord, help us to understand the word, that which is supposed to be understood. Help us, the readers, to understand and to be warned. For in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you. Join us again next week as we continue with the Great Tribulation.